Hello, everybody, and welcome to the first Q Community Town Hall. Indeed, everybody who's joining us today. I think there's probably some newcomers to the Q language, but those who've been using Q since the very beginning as well. This is the very first Q community event, at least that we're of, so we're very excited. I'm just going to check that we've still got. Just check that we've got a nice clean link through to YouTube. Perhaps we can get some thumbs up that the audio quality, etc., is okay. Video quality looks good. Marcel, do you want to give us a quick hello?
Hello, I'm here. Welcome, everybody. Good to see you here.
Yep.
Joel, others.
Yeah, we've got a whole load of folks joining on YouTube, so welcome, everybody. Just to warn you, the format today might be a little rough around the edges, so please bear with us if things don't quite go to plan. And please just shout if actually audio quality or video quality sort of drops off via the comments in the live stream on YouTube. And we'll be keeping half an eye on that, on those comments there. I'm going to try and do something a bit funky now using... Oh, yes, I should have put this up first of all. There's a link to the Q project. And just a reminder that please follow us on Twitter. Twitter's been a really useful communication medium since the beginning of the summer, and we'll start using that more and more. So please follow us on Twitter. Thank you to everybody who on that subject. Thank you to everybody who helped retweet announcement of this event, sharing it with your followers. We'll be tweeting a link to the recording afterwards for those who weren't able to join live. Indeed, we're very aware that this time has not been good for all time zones. So apologies to those who we have missed live today. We'll talk later about how we plan for future community events like this to be friendly to all time zones. So without further ado, let's move on to some quick introductions, especially for those who are new to Q. Marcel, do you want to kick us off on that front?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I'm Marcel van Lohuizen. I'm the creator of Q. So I recently left Google after almost 19 years to work on Q full time. So at Google, I was on the founding team of Borg, which is the predecessor of Kubernetes. You could call it like that. I was there responsible for creating BCL and GCL, which are configuration languages, and also the Borg orchestration tooling like Borg config. And some of you might know me better from my work on the Go team, because that was actually open source and public. And so towards the last end of my tenure at Google, I started working on Q. And as said, since recently, I decided to go at it, independently with Paul.
Great. Thanks, Marcel. Yes, Marcel said I'm also a core contributor to the Q project. And sort of thinking about the Go heritage here, I helped start the Go tools working group back in 2018, I think it was, and met Marcel actually the year before in 2017. I've been working closely with the Go team over that time, and became a core contributor to Q when I started working on playwithgo.dev, a project that's actually sponsored by Google. That provides interactive guides for the tools that are needed to work with the Go programming language. And it was our design that we actually chose to use Q as a significant part of that project. Unsurprisingly, given Marcel's time on the Go team, the Q project is heavily based on the Go project from an engineering perspective, even though the two are solving sort of very different problems. And I guess people who have interacted with the project so far sort of see quite a lot of crossover between the two projects there.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. I mean, it's easy to continue on a framework if it's already there, right?
Yeah.
So it saves brain cycles.
If it ain't broke, don't fix it. But that's the thing. I think where there are things that could do with revamping, then we're obviously open to thinking about that. Thank you to everybody's patience during what's been sort of an extended summer break. Marcel, as he said, left Google the end of June, beginning of July. Thank you to those who have continued to ask questions about Q in that time, to those who've raised issues, created PRs. Thank you also to those who have helped answer some of those questions, triage issues, those people who have written blog posts about Q. Marcel, I'm sort of particularly minded of a blog post from John Arundel. Q is an exciting configuration language. Have you ever heard it described as exciting configuration?
No, not much. No, yeah, yeah.
Well, that blog post might well be a first
But
then.
we, yeah, it's a very good compliment, right? Like,
I can't quite tell whether it was tongue in cheek or not, but it was an excellent blog post from John and got some fairly wide reach. So thank you for that. Others who have live streamed content about Q as well. Brian Kettleson and David Flanagan have done some excellent work in around Q blocks, which is a project that they're working on that uses Q very heavily. Yeah, so sort of the summer was really dedicated to taking a bit of time off. I guess, Marcel, 19 years is a long time at Google, so you needed a bit of a break.
yeah, a bit of traveling insofar possible with COVID. A little bit of cleaning up around the house, organizing things a little bit. All very necessary and neglected. Yeah, spending some time with the family, of course.
Great. Well, the
Yeah,
Gophers look very tidy on the shelf behind you there.
yeah, that was
I'm
took
I'm glad you had a
some
good
work.
break, well earned, and I'm sure the family enjoyed spending
Yeah,
time with you as well.
yeah. Part of the time, so I had to deal with some health issues with a family member, which took up some bandwidth as well. So that's also why the break was maybe a little bit longer than planned initially.
Well, thank
Yeah,
you for sharing that. It goes without saying that family comes first in these situations. Wish you and the family the very best on that.
yeah.
I guess we should also acknowledge that some people contacted us privately to offer you their support during that time as well.
Yes. Yeah, definitely. Thank you all for that, for the people who knew and offered to help. So that's very much appreciated.
Yeah, indeed. Indeed, it's that sort of, I guess it's really that sort of kindness and support in the community that's one of the reasons we're especially excited to be back in the flow today. Delighted to see that there's been a lot of interest in today's session. I'm very excited, I'm sure you are too, to sort of re-engage with the project in the wider Q community and help sort of set out a vision for the future of Q as well. So for those who are new to Q, I was going to put up a link here to the project homepage. I'll do this one again. Hopefully that works. There we go. There is the
Mhm.
project homepage there, qlang.org. That links to all the sort of the critical parts of the project, the community spaces, as well as the issue tracker. So please start there, and it sort of links through as well to how to join the Slack community. Quite a bit more discussion happening on GitHub, especially GitHub discussions these days. So please come and check us out there. You could be a long-time user of Q, in which case, as we said earlier, welcome. Indeed, we learned the other day about someone who sketched out a role-based access control setup the day that Q was released. Marcel, do you even remember when Q was released? The specific day? Was it sometime back in 2018?
Yeah, somewhere November 2018, roughly. I don't really keep track, to be honest. But
No particular memories from that
yeah,
day. The date wasn't significant or anything like that. I guess as someone who comes to mind in that respect, as sort of an early Q adopter, is Cedric Charlie as well, who's a long-time advocate of Q. He's done some really good writing on Q and how it should be widely adopted.
yeah, absolutely. Great writings. I would encourage people to read it. What was it? Configuration complexity course is one of his
Yeah.
blogs. Quite good.
We'll include some links to these afterwards, and we've actually tweeted out a couple of links in the past, so we'll be sure to do that afterwards as well. But yes, great. Even though it was sort of released back in 2018, great to see that Q can still make the front page of Hacker News, as I think it did the other day. I wasn't
Again,
actually
yes. Yeah.
keeping up to track with that. So let's just sort of quick overview of what we plan to cover today. There is a lot. Thank you to everybody who submitted questions ahead of time. I realize it's a slightly unusual town hall format in that it would be a town hall would sort of classically be interactive. We've got quite a lot to cover today, so appreciate submitting questions in advance. And I think for future community sessions, we'll actually try and make things more interactive because that is considerably more fun, if nothing else. So what are we going to cover today? The fork from Google that we did at the beginning of July, foundation, whatever sort of everything that falls under that sort of heading, the contribution process, high-level roadmap, open issues, documentation, sort of drilling into one of the sort of the key areas that people have flagged up, proposals, that exists in the Q project at the moment. Talking a bit about next steps, what we're going to do in these spaces, and then sort of close at the end. Our aim is to have this done within an hour. I suspect that might be a tiny bit optimistic, but we'll see how we get on. So let's just go to the first topic today, the fork from Google. I've got a special link here. This was the announcement back in June of this year, where we announced that Q has a new home. And I guess one of the questions that's come up a number of times is, why do we actually need to fork?
Yeah. Yeah. So moving a GitHub organization. So the GitHub organization was owned by Google, the original one. And, Google sometimes moves it to a foundation, and even more rarely moves it to an individual. But if it's an individual outside of the US, in my case, it's legally just very complicated. So we had a choice, right? Like either do this process quickly or go through a more lengthy process, moving it to a foundation now, which also, like begs the question then what kind of foundation. So in the end, we agreed with the open source program office, who have been very helpful in all of this, that the fork really is, open source as intended, and it's by far the easiest process to hand over control to a different entity, in this case. So it was really just being pragmatic about everything.
I think
And
there's even a good example, a good precedent. It wasn't the Vue.js project one, I think, that was cited as something that had done exactly this kind of fork before.
I believe so. Yeah, that's what they
Yeah.
mentioned. Yeah, but yeah, everything in full cooperation with Google's open source program office, and thanks a lot to their support here.
Yeah, absolutely. So now let's just highlight, I'll use one of these funky overlays again here. The new GitHub repository is that link on screen now. And everything, including the project homepage, everything should now point, albeit it won't necessarily redirect, but to that new GitHub repository. And that is a clean fork. And so I guess that helps as far as control of that organization is concerned, right? Because it's the q-lang. Let me just put that up on screen again. It's the q-lang organization within which we can control the repositories, create new repositories as well.
Yeah, since it's just us now, it makes it a little bit easier to add repos. So there's no formal process for it anymore. So, adding repos for different language, like bindings or like editor plugins or whatever is now something that is, a lot easier to do.
Slightly sadly, we lost all of those stars, though.
That's too bad. Yeah, thanks for everybody for adding them back. Huh? We're growing quickly now, but it's, would be good to if everybody
Unfortunately,
restarts. Yeah.
yeah, we couldn't wave a magic wand there, unfortunately.
No.
But thank you to those who have started. Please share the new repository. It is a good indication of the success of the project and how people are using it. We just sort of have to add some percentage, if we like, of the original stars in our sort of mental calculations. I guess sort of moving on from the fork from Google, let's move to sort of a topic that is sort of falls under the heading perhaps of foundation, because foundation was a word that was mentioned in the original post that announced the move of Q to a new repository. This actually touches on a couple of questions as well. Thank you again to those who submitted them, from Tony Worm and Cedric Charlie. It is one of those points that we mentioned in that sort of migration issue. So spending a bit of time talking about that now makes sense to update people on our thoughts in this space. As Marcel alluded to, it's not totally clear necessarily what shape of foundation or what type of foundation makes sense for Q. So instead, what we've been doing is trying to sort of step back and think about what it is what we think we should be trying to solve for. As for the Q project, right? And this is where, if people have things to add to this list, that would be great. So, sort of at a high level, these points sort of come to mind. Is that what we should really be trying to focus on? Is creating the greatest good for the greatest number of people, as far as the Q project is concerned. Having a strong, cohesive, evidence-driven, experience-driven, long-term technical vision. That's sort of how Q has gotten to this point for now. Continuity of technical decision making, and we'll sort of drill into these points a bit more in a second. A strong vision for broad and wide adoption of the Q project. Clearly defined ownership and licensing model as well. And just broadly speaking, and this is a bit of a more of a fuzzy point here, a well-run project. And so maybe let's just sort of drill into that as an example, and to touch on a couple of examples. When I think of well-run project, I think of something like a proposal process, Marcel. That we have something. It's not quite like the Go proposal process yet, but it's the sort of the makings of that, maybe.
Yeah, right now we just have like an issue marked as proposal, but there's of course different factors in it. Who decides who to accept a proposal, but also who implements it. How does that get decided? So there's this whole like what are the criteria for it that needs to be documented on the basis of which we accept something or not. So
Yep.
these are all things that need to be streamlined.
Yep. The long-term sort of technical vision is something which you've helped get to this point now, and for that's sort of something that we don't necessarily see changing, given your experience with configuration and configuration at Google, excuse me. And perhaps there's sort of the experience playing a role in all of this is even more important, given that Q sort of does play this kind of interlingua role as well between all the sorts of different encodings as well. So I think one thing that we'll want to try and ensure is that we bolster sort of support from people who have experience in those different areas to help complement the experience we have already in that space. Continuity of technical decision making is a big one, because this sort of brings into scope, I guess, the question of bus factor. In that there is one Marcel at the moment. We're working on a clone.
Yeah.
And it's a point that a number of people have raised in the past, and I guess therefore a very important point to be solving for as well. And related to it is, of course, growing the core contributors. And that's, again, something that lots of people have talked about. We've got a separate section. We're talking a bit about the contribution process and how we think we can address sort of issues in that space, if you like. But just to sort of highlight that growing core contributors is clearly something that we should be doing, and what we should be trying to solve for the Q project itself. Delegating when necessary. Again, I think we'll talk a bit later, won't we, Marcel, about sort of examples of where.
Yeah, we have some ideas there on how we can do that and segment it.
Yep.
We'll get back to that.
Yeah, indeed. Great. I guess sort of back onto the point about a strong vision for a broad and wide adoption of the Q project. We both have experience. I have experience from outside of Google, and you from inside of the Go project itself. And the Go community itself. A key thing is, to my mind, that we need to foster a warm and welcoming community.
Yeah.
Right? We have a code of conduct already. Anything else that you want to sort of talk about in that respect there?
Yeah, I think the community so far has been, people have been respectful. It's been a really great community, and we like to keep it that way, especially. Yeah. So that's a very high priority for us to keep it like that.
Yep. And obviously, a function of how welcoming a community is a growing user base as well. And again, that sort of brings us to the point about documentation. Again, we'll come back to that, because that's obviously a big point. Growing contributor base. I think that a key thing, again, from the experience from the Go project, is that people need to see their contributions being recognized. Again, we'll talk about the contribution process a bit later in the session now. But I think it's also important in the context of thinking about sustainability for the Q project as well, that we need to understand that contributions come from people in different circumstances. So it might well be that some people are contributing to the Q project as part of their day job. Fantastic, right? Others will be doing it in their spare time, and sort of other people somewhere along that spectrum. So I think we need to, in trying to think about what we're trying to solve for the Q project and its longevity and success, we need to acknowledge and support and reflect the fact that people do want to contribute in different ways. I think particularly in this example of the Rust project and how they're starting to establish their foundation. Rust is, I think, over 10 years old, and they're still in the process of establishing their foundation, and how core contributors who choose to can focus on the Rust project and be supported in doing so. So it is something that will take time to actually put in place. But again, that's a key part of helping to grow the contributor base. Excuse me, acknowledging that not everybody works at a company who can say, yeah, dedicate yourself 100% to working on Q. Anything? I don't know whether you have anything to particularly talk about on the ownership and licensing model.
Yeah, not quite yet. I mean, it's open source, but
Yeah,
yeah,
and with the
um,
clean fork from Google as well,
yeah,
it's just worth re-emphasizing there. I think another thing, obviously under the heading of well-run project, I would say that in conversations we've had with people, I guess governance and transparency is an important thing. People being clear how the project is run.
yeah. We need to have some clarity there on how it is run and what decides what goes in. I think we need to have one of my ideas is to have some sort of constitution for Q, as into what determining like what kind of changes will be accepted or can be accepted, and what are sort of hard limits of what cannot be. We need to set both the lines very clear. What will we accept and not, and also like what kind of changes are even possible within Q, right?
Yeah,
Like for example, you cannot break changes in a language, or you cannot add changes in a language that will break the lattice model, for example, right? Like that's an obvious one, but we can be listing a whole bunch of those. Yeah,
again, sort of under the topic of well-run project, I think about sort of a clearly defined structure. I think Blender have the Blender organization have a good model here, at least from a communication perspective, where they clearly describe on their website what the decision making process and organizational structure is,
yeah,
and how it sort of addresses the points that we're talking about now of what we're trying to solve for. So if
yeah,
we a key part is being able to communicate to people, okay, if we have a foundation, why does it exist? What is it actually responsible for doing? And what are its legal responsibilities, fiduciary responsibilities, and making that model very clear in people's minds. Again, I think if we hang everything off this idea of what are we trying to solve for with the project, then the reason that we have a foundation, or the reason that we have entity X will sort of become clearer, I think, as
yeah,
part of it. I also think we need to ensure that we get the right people to the table in various discussions as well.
yeah.
We talked about it earlier on, having subject matter experts
Yeah.
in various places.
Yeah, in general, it's really good, and I cannot, overemphasize this. It's really good to always ground changes or additions in real life examples, right? Like sort of focus on what needs to be supported, right? Like what are the key use cases for Q, and then make sure that these all the changes are basically based on real life examples. That's why sometimes I ask with issues like, what's the real life use case here? Uh, you
Yeah,
know, Not that it's not a good idea if it's not, but it's important to ground it. Yeah,
totally. Yeah. I think as well. My sense is that again, sort of thinking to the Go project, and indeed many others. I don't want to sort of feel like I'm blinkered on just the Go project, but the Q project should be a Q project that responds well to feedback. For
yeah,
anyone who interacts with the project in a way that is, from their perspective, suboptimal, understanding why that has been suboptimal, and reflecting on whether there is, within the constraints of the wider project, anything that can be done to improve the situation.
yeah,
Now, that's sort of a fairly general goal, I guess, but it's an important one, I think, to probably have written down and be sure that we can always address those types of points. So
yeah,
documentation is one that people have flagged, right? And I just use that as one. There could be others.
yeah,
Um, so in sort of thinking about these sort of high level points here of what it is we're trying to solve for, and what organizations might evolve from that situation. We talked, I think, about documenting this list, didn't we, and sharing that with the community to sort of get feedback from others in the wider community to say, well, okay, are we missing anything from this list
yeah.
here, and sort of refine that. I don't know really what to call that list other than a list of things we're trying to solve for. So maybe somebody's got a better idea for what we should call that.
Maybe some
Um,
nice acronym.
yeah. um, and then sort of step back and start to examine where there are gaps and shortcomings in meeting these aspirations. Some of them are very clear. I'll mention documentation again, right? Because documentation influences so many things, like growing the user base, growing the contributor base, even as well. And then, but so once we have that and iterate on that, sort of ask ourselves what kind of structures and indeed financing will help us fill those gaps,
Yeah.
right? So if, for example, if we do consider following a model whereby, like the Rust project, where core contributors to the project or even content creators, like the Blender model, where are paid for that for their contributions, that might be something that we consider. So I guess the next step here on this one is to start that documentation process. Sort of as yet decided, I guess, whether it's going to be a discussion. Probably good to start it. Is that right?
Yeah, maybe in a separate repo for like governance, or I don't know.
Yeah.
We'll see. Yeah.
But in any case, we'll link that so that people can share their thoughts on the things that you think that Q project should be solving for, because it's effectively collectively something that we need to address and answer. I think the only closing point I would make here is that, as I mentioned earlier on with the Rust example, these things do take time as we're learning. There aren't any. There's sort of lots of fuzzy boundaries, if you like, as to what type of foundation is important and what one's not. Rust is 10 years old and still in the process of properly establishing their foundation, its role, the staffing, etc. And I think that's well over a year into the process. So no quick answers on that front. Talking about the growing the contributor base, I guess we could do a bit more of a dive on the contribution process
Yeah,
at this point.
that's good.
We had a number of questions
Yeah.
via the GitHub discussion from Stephen Harris, Joel Longtine, and Banst. Apologies, I only know you by your username. Growing the contributor base, excuse me, is clearly a key
Yeah.
part of ensuring the longevity of the project. Continuity in various
Yeah.
areas. But I guess there's a very wide range of ways in
Yeah.
which people can contribute to the project.
Yeah, contribution is definitely not just code, right? Like it's a very wide thing. So a very simple thing to do is, for example, register your project with Unity, right, to get more transparency. Um, it's also telling us what works. Like as I said, we want to ground new changes into real life examples, and some of the proposals have been stuck a little bit, because we need more of these examples, or where we're not entirely certain yet. If we're cover a certain area properly. So we've been getting more examples, but these are actually incredibly useful.
And I guess those examples also help to stop scope creep. I just sort of see a question
Yeah.
on the YouTube channel now. It really
Yeah.
helps ground
Yeah.
the project in real life examples.
The grounding is very, very important. Not just knowing that people use it, but to actually see it actually solves the problem, and there's not some unexpected edge case or sort of awkwardness if you're developing it. So any interaction is really like these kind of examples are just as much a contribution as code,
Yep.
right? And contribute actually to the project very much.
Is it worth talking about Unity at this point as a way in which people can contribute? Their use of Q can and has on many occasions actually demonstrated edge cases that we as
Yeah.
the project haven't considered. And
Yeah.
Unity is, let's just talk about what Unity is, I guess, first
Yeah,
of all.
so Unity is so people can register their repos under Unity. We'll probably merge it in the Qlang organization at some point, or we'll have
Yep.
to see. Um, but basically, what it allows us to do, like it's with the Go project, we would always, when there's a new release, we would test it against a large body of code at Google. We don't really have that luxury here, right? Like it's not that grown that much, but basically, it allows us to test whether new releases are not breaking things unexpectedly, right? Like either performance or anything like that. So by registering your project, you get some assurance, right, that new releases won't break you. But at the same time, it also gives us insight on how things are used, and basically allowing us to verify new features if they're grounded properly, right? So we've,
Yep.
for example, seen some cases where the standard directory organization and modules really doesn't work, right, for some users. And so this is a really great example. Okay, like how what kind of feature, or how can we basically extend that model and allow it to work in more cases, right? But without that specific use case, we wouldn't have known about why it wasn't working or things like that. So Unity is really helpful to
I think
us.
particularly as well, Joel Longtime had actually contributed has a repository that is part of Unity CloudFormation Q that has also helped to identify, excuse me, some performance issues, and we'll talk about performance issues later on. So, but just to again highlight, there's many different ways in which we can sort of unexpectedly find out about problems when we're doing work on new features within Q itself. We get flagged about those early, and
Yeah,
that helps because by having a large body of code within Unity. Um, Again, just sort of going through the list of different ways that people can contribute, reporting back, telling us what works well and what doesn't work well with Q, your interactions with the project, pointing out gaps, asking questions via GitHub discussions or Slack, raising issues, helping to manage issues, answer discussions, code contributions we've talked about, and we'll talk about that a bit more in a second. Contributing thoughts to proposals. Marcel, we've had a number of people who
yeah.
haven't necessarily used Q, but sort of bringing expertise from different areas to
Yeah.
those proposals.
And also commenting on our proposals, right? Like there's
Yeah.
definitely some proposals that have not been executed, right? Because people had objections that were valid, and so we don't do it, or back to the drawing board, right? So
Or
that's
just edge cases that we totally hadn't considered, right? And
yeah,
so that's
exactly.
incredibly useful because, of course, it then saves the effort of implementing it
Yeah,
one way, the wrong way, and then having to do it again. We talked earlier on about writing blog posts. Content creation around Q is great. Blog posts, live streaming, holding community events, all these things are
tutorials.
contributions.
Yeah,
Yes,
yeah,
well, actually, I'll mention tutorials later on. Actually, in many respects, so in that respect, GitHub's model for contributions, where it's by commits, it really belies the real contribution graph,
yeah,
right? And we don't have a way of um, effectively reporting that, but just to sort of acknowledge to the wider community that we do see contribution as being a very broad definition. So thank you to everybody who does contribute
yeah,
in those ways. Talking about code contributions, the Q code base derives fairly heavily from the Go code base,
yeah,
but nonetheless, there are some unique challenges with contributing to Q. Do you want to talk a
yeah.
bit about those?
Yeah, so in general, programming languages, and this holds also for configuration languages, if you change a language or add a feature to the language, it is incredibly hard to see all the consequences. It's even more than with APIs. Once you put in, you cannot take it back, but that's only part of the problem. There's a lot of many interconnected parts within a language, like how things interact, which take a long time to consider. So, for example, with the required frill proposal, we had a 20-page proposal, something like that, which was only a fraction of all the things we considered. And then there was, I think Paul noted one issue, or somebody did. I think it was you, Paul,
I don't
and
remember.
which basically meant like, okay, in the trash can, back to the drawing board, right? So this is it's very hard to look at a single case here and then say like, yeah, this is a good feature. You need to consider a very wide area. So this is for languages, but with Q particularly, there's this other thing um, where there's many components to Q, and if you add one thing, so to give an example, right, there was this pull request from Luke Perkins, by itself perfect pull request, right? Like added num runes, the num runes built into the strings package um, to complement basically max runes and min runes, right? So in some cases, you want to have an exact number instead of having to specify both max and min. So by itself, a very good PR. The problem is that the max runes and min runes built-ins have mappings to OpenAPI JSON schema, and so by adding num runes, you now also need to add those mappings to stay consistent, right? So even there, like you cannot really see a change in isolation. You have to see it in like the whole Q ecosystem. And How we deal with that, like remains to be seen. At the very least, we need to have better documentation. Like these are the things that need to be considered, for adding a build-in. But is it reasonable for somebody that writes such a build-in to also add all the other things? Like, well, we don't know, right?
Mm.
Maybe it's good enough to add the build-in with the requirement that before the next release, all these other things need to be supported too. But right now, there's no process and no way to handle this. So as a consequence, this PR still hasn't been submitted, right? Because that
Yep.
would so
I,
so this is something we need to deal with. Yeah,
I guess that point about documentation, again, that
yeah,
famous word, holds even for the contribution process as well.
yeah,
And a couple of people have, since the Google fork, sort of highlighted that we could be clearer. Um, I think one of the things that I would particularly like to do is a live stream of an actual code contribution via GitHub, because of course we accept pull requests via GitHub and Gerrit Hub, which is the open source hosted version of Gerrit, to sort of help. And I guess this picks up on the point made by Jean-Philippe Brown as well, that we should be clear about how people can contribute to the
yeah,
project. That will obviously be a start, but I guess it touches on all the points that you made there of, okay, even if you know how to mechanically make a contribution, there's then sort of still a large blank space as to how and where do you actually make changes. And so in that respect, we have the contribution guide, and we need to emphasize this point a bit better, I think, is that starting with an issue really is the best way of motivating making a change. And I guess that's something that we would continue to encourage. GitHub will remain a channel through which people can contribute, just to emphasize that point.
yeah,
Um, and it's sort of semi-related to this. Cedric Charlie raised a question on building out relationships and tooling to integrate Q with other tools and products.
yeah.
That's something we very much want to do.
Yeah, and I think this is also one of these things that would, could be very nicely organized in certain modules, right? So within the foundation, for example, where people could work on such a project or be responsible for one of like integrations, for example, to have a
Yep.
certain integration point persons
Yep.
to manage these. So that would be. Interesting way to do this, right? And having some process of like any integrations, again being documented. So, for example, I think it's reasonable to support TOML, right? But then who's gonna support that, right? Who's going to be responsible for it? Like we need to have some
Yeah.
scalable model around that.
Absolutely. Just let's conclude on that discussion point there by just thanking those who, through all the means that we described before, contribute to the Q project. It's very much appreciated, and we're delighted to hear sort of feedback on ways in which that contribution process in those various different forms can be improved. Moving next to sort of high level roadmap, and this picks up a point made by a number of people, especially Alex Atkol. I guess the most important goal here is, from a high level perspective, we're trying to get Q to V1.
Yeah, yeah. So we've seen this with the Go project, right? Like that. Grow was picking up adoption reasonably well, right? But as soon as backwards compatibility was guaranteed, it took off, right? And basically, within a production environment, you don't really want to deal with backwards incompatibility. So we realized that. We're not ready to go there yet, but it's very high priority, and it's also even if we're not reaching there yet, our goal is to knock off all the things that might have some impact on that road as quickly as possible. Right. So
Yep.
that's a very important thing. Stability is key here.
Yep. If for something as foundational as a language, right, that sort of feels
Yeah.
super important.
And the same thing holds with the API as well, of course. It might
Yep.
be that the language reaches there earlier than the API. I don't know how that versioning will look like yet, but we'll figure that out, right?
Indeed. And
Yeah.
in sort of in the context of thinking about V1, we naturally then talk about breaking changes. What do we actually mean by breaking changes?
Yeah, that's a good question. So there's really different categories of breaking changes. One that will not be covered by the scope of V 1.0 is just as with Go, right? As if there is inconsistencies in the spec, like wrong implementations or bugs, basically. Um, so we'll fix bugs if we need to fix bugs, even if that means that people relying on these bugs will be broken. Again, Unity can really help there, right? Like we
Yep.
can identify it early. And also, so for example, there is, I wrote it down, like issue 543, like don't allow introduction of non-hidden definitions in a closed struct. So that's actually a bug, but we're treating it as a language change, right? So because we know that some people are depending on this bug, and like it's kind of a nasty one to break under people's foot, so we were treating it as that. So other than that, so you have breaking changes that really we can't even provide much support for, right? We've tried to knock these out already. Like most of them are gone by now, but this might happen. So then you have the breaking changes for which we can build tooling in the form of
Yep.
fix and stuff like that that can automate the transition.
People have talked
Um,
about that sort of qfix/qfumped being a lifesaver with
yeah,
the changes that have happened in the past.
exactly. Yeah, and then maybe even use that for schema in the future. That's a different thing. Also for the APIs, right? Like
Yeah,
that's clear. Um, and then you have changes that aren't really creating backwards incompatibility per se, but they might change the way you organize or would structure queue, right? So these also are not covered, I would say, by the V1. Backwards compatibility guarantee. You can see it maybe a little bit with as the Go generics, right? Like that's not really adding. Um, um, so that's not really adding any backwards incompatibility, but people will maybe would have written libraries differently if they had this feature before, right? So
sure.
that's
Apologies if anybody's getting a bit of background noise from children that are being looked after in the background here on my end. I'll try and keep that to a minimum. Um, I guess we don't. There's sort of a few language changes that we've mentioned in the past as well. Slices.
yeah.
Nothing particular to say about that now necessarily, I guess.
Yeah, well, yeah, slices are technically not supported. They're not in the spec, right? But they were implemented at some point and then changed them. But we'll deal with that in some nice way, right? We might actually add it back to the language in an official manner without any people requiring any changes. Yeah, some insidious ones are int versus float. It will have very little impact on people, but it will probably be more or less backwards compatible. But it's a very hard change actually to really think about. It's very interesting implication. So we have to be careful with them. And then something like typecast, downcast. I mean, these are really
Yeah.
language features that are not breaking changes, right? So that's
So there's a number of categories of things in the sort of the breaking changes category.
yeah.
That sort of
Yeah, required fields is interesting there, right? Because that's really changing the way you think. It doesn't necessarily, except for in the tooling layer, changes the way it behaves at the language level.
yeah, we come back to required fields
Yeah,
later on as sort of one of those major proposals.
yeah,
Back to the sort of the high level roadmap, modules and package management is a big one.
yeah.
Again, sort of learning from and leaning on, in some respects, the Go experience here. This was a point that was made by Banst as well in the questions. This is a biggie. This one.
Yes. So Paul wrote a proposal. We got some pushback on that on the fringes. So we did. Paul also identified another issue with like dealing with packages and modules within for Q specifically, because Q has to be co-versioned with other languages, because you might check in a binary which also has a Q configuration, right, which might import other Q. So all of this is essentially incorporated. Like we're now working on a new proposal that incorporates all these observations and aims to be more language independent and sort of integrate with existing package management. In the end, it turns out to be remarkably simple-ish. Um, and also, we're thinking a little bit more about what some people pointed out on how to learn from Go and have a more sort of less hardlined versioning, right, and more incremental. And like some of Rich Hickey's ideas in a speculation talk are making its way in, right? Although that's not strictly necessary for a V1 of the proposal, if you want.
Yeah. I was going
But
to say, I think there's probably, and we'll be clear to point this out as well, is that there is a happy path, for want of a better phrase, of
yeah,
what initial module support looks like for
yeah,
pure Q, and then, as you said, I think there are other things
yeah.
that get built on top of that.
Yeah, but it's good to take this into account and set a vision of where modules will go, and then
Yeah,
basically, make a simple proposal that we can implement now that is compatible with that vision in the future.
completely. But that really very much in line with a lot of the work that everything that you have done in Q to date is really to understand that
Yeah.
wider picture first of all, right? So
Okay. Yeah. Stephen Harris says replacing uh, bottom. Let's call it bottom all over the place in favor of new built-in function is significant. Yeah, that's definitely. Isn't there a isn't that
there is,
somewhere in the
yeah.
proposal? Yeah, I think
Exactly.
so.
Yeah. We'll come to that one later on.
Yeah.
We talk about proposals later on. Um, the less
Let's
said
call it the
about bottom,
bird.
the
We call it
better.
the
Yeah.
bird
Exactly.
symbol. What? Yeah. Yeah.
Another high level roadmap issue, not issue, but high level sort of something else that's on the high level roadmap. Wider support for different encodings. A point made by Alex at Cole. Um, the matrix of encoding support is fairly large. If we think about JSON, YAML, help me out here, Marcel.
Yeah,
JSON
TOML
schema.
would be an obvious one, right? XML is potentially one. So there's XML is a tricky one, right? Because you can say the new how did we call it again? This God, the embedded scalars, right, can be useful
Ah,
there to some extent, right? So we'll have to see, but or attributes or definitions, right? Like all of this can interact with XML in a way that we can do it quite nicely. But so that might require some more thought. But yeah, I mean, there's HCL. Yeah, HCL is a tricky one though, but because that doesn't map one to one. But definitely expanding HCL and sort of mapping to that is something we'd
let's
consider.
not forget things like we already have support for, but not complete support. JSON schema being one of them.
JSON schema. Yeah,
JSON schema, protobuf. Let's also include in this list of encodings languages as well, like Go,
yeah,
and then different languages. So that's broadly what we're imagining under this header, if you like.
yeah.
Um, and this is, I guess, where we also, referring to a point we made earlier on, do have this is an area where it can be very nicely carved out for a maintainer or maintainers plural to look after these different encodings. Anything else you want to talk about there?
Yeah, with so good guidelines. So this could be under the foundation or not, or we'll see. Yeah,
Yeah,
but I think that's we need to make this scalable, right? So having people
totally.
responsible for the individual
And
uh,
again, sort of good
integration.
documentation around what an encoding being added to the project actually means.
Yeah,
Sort of much like in some respects, if I was to draw a parallel with the different ports of the Go project,
yeah,
that would be a good example, right? This very nicely documented, and the bar as to what represents an officially supported port is very clearly documented.
yeah,
Um, Documentation is another high level roadmap. We'll come back to that in a
yeah.
second. Performance. Joel Longtime sort of raised a question on performance. This is obviously a key one for lots of people.
Um, yeah, so definitely. So as you know, there has been a new evaluator. So the new evaluator really focused on abstract data type representation that is very efficient for Q. It was a first attempt implementation. So somebody gave me this talk from I think it was incremental. It's like maybe you can learn something from it and avoid mistakes. So the only thing it taught me is that we need to do more rewrites, right, and that it's inevitable. But keep in mind, like the rewrite we had now was really also changing semantics, right? So we don't expect when there's new rewrites to really be changing the semantics, right? It's about fixing bugs, increasing performance. And that's yeah, so as we are doing other rewrites, right, it's really a matter of that, right? Like we're really not trying to make any changes with the language. And again, having your projects into Unity really helps catching
Yeah,
errors there earlier. um, but yeah, so the rewrites would be mostly on the algorithmic level. We can now do more incremental rewrites, if that makes sense, right? Like, whereas before we had to change the data types and the
yeah.
algorithms. Now we could, for example, I can envision rewrites where we keep the data types the same, but just change the algorithms.
That
Um,
picks up on a point actually that the question that Stephen Harris asked offline is,
yes,
can we imagine, are these going to be big bang rewrites? It
yeah.
sounds like it's going to be sort of more surgical than that.
It's definitely more surgical, and they shouldn't be impactful for the users, except solving their bugs and making things
So
faster.
again, unity as far as helping
Unity.
to flush out these performance.
Yes, and make sure that people don't get broken. Yeah, for
Totally.
themselves. So yeah,
Yep. Error handling is another high level roadmap issue.
yeah,
That's a slightly trickier one.
yeah. You have to find a balance between performance and precision. So the goal so far has been to find a solution that works under all circumstances. um, like if gathering information versus throwing it away, and still having good error messages. But I can imagine that there are scenarios where we say, okay, there's a different mode to run where we get more information, right? Or maybe compute it after the fact. Um, but the new data types, abstract data types that we have, are actually quite good at being able to reach a lot of the information that you would need for very good error handling. It's just a matter again there of finding the right balance, and sort of actually using that, right? So this is
Yep.
still, some of the error messages are still left over from the old implementation,
Yep.
but we can actually do a lot better now. But again, um, we know also again from the Go project, right? It's a very fine balance, and it's not always obvious what the error message should be for the user. So dumping tons of information clearly isn't always useful, right? And then finding the right level of abstractions. Do people want to see here, like conflicts in types or conflicts in values, or both, or what kind of backtrace do they want to see? How many locations, right? Like that's something we need feedback on
Yep.
eventually.
Definitely. The final item on this high level roadmap is developer tools. This point really picked up by a number of people, Banst and Joel Longtime, especially. Language server protocol is the top one here, right?
Yeah, absolutely critical. Yeah,
So I was involved with Go Please, and the success of Go Please has really been fantastic to see. And Rebecca Sambler and team who worked on that have done a fantastic job. And it has really helped unite, as far as is possible in the world of editor wars, Go developers, and provide that much more consistent experience with respect to developing a language.
yeah,
So that is obviously top of our
yeah.
list.
And there's a little bit of a bootstrapping problem there, because setting up editor integrations and like all these things, and then also writing the algorithms for the analysis, and then doing this and that. That's like a lot of different types of knowledge that need to come together for a
Yep.
first version, and not many people have that, right? So it makes it hard to get going. But once we have an initial framework, I think it's much more easy for people there to contribute there in their
Yep.
individual areas of
I was
expertise.
going to say there's another sort of contribution area that will become clearer. I think it
Yeah,
with in the near future. But looking to lean on the Go Please project itself, in that a lot of what the Go Please project has done is actually reusable, and so bootstrapping off the back of that, and then as you said, moving to the Q
yeah,
specifics will be,
yeah,
I think, is the way forward there.
yeah.
Um, Anything else on the high level roadmap issues?
Well, the so other tools, right, like
Oh
Qtest
yes,
is an important one. So I've over the past 1.5 years, I've made various designs for that. There some of the things that are holding up there is again setting the vision, right, the grand vision. I mean, there's some crazy cool things one can do with Qtest, because essentially a Q schema defines the space of all possible values, right? So it's a very good guideline for fuzzing and stuff like that. You can really
yep.
make very good test setups with Qtest. Um, so the idea is now distilling this down to something simple to get us going first, right? Like, but
Q, yeah, QDoc is another one. I can't remember. I can't believe we didn't mention that. Is GoDoc is obviously the basis for package.go.dev and other
yeah,
documentation sites. QDoc will sort of need to exist, I guess, in some sort of similar form.
yeah, yeah. Right now we're piggybacking on GoDoc, for the built-ins and stuff like
Yeah.
that, but it's clearly not the desired state.
Great. So I think that's it on the. I'm totally aware we're going to go well over the hour, so I'll keep us moving as quickly as we can. That's it on the high level roadmap issues. Sort of touching on a point now about the number of open issues in the project. This particularly picks up on a point made by Stephen Harris about the number of open issues. Sort of how do those open issues actually break down in terms of categories? Are there any areas of concern in those open
Yeah,
issues?
not really. A lot of the new ones seem fairly small-ish and sort of independent. I haven't really seen new, like issues identifying new performance or engine-related issues. I think most of aside from the performance issues, which can be severe, right? Like and we know, again, we know how to address these, right? But it will take some time. But a part of the performance issues, like all the sort of serious, there are bugs in evaluation, but they're quite esoteric for the most part.
Mm-hmm.
And I haven't seen any new unknown things revealed or lately, which is good, I guess. So
But
some of that will require an evaluator rewrite, but
I was going to say, yeah, yeah.
yeah,
And
but
again, the sort of the
that's,
key watchword here being that the more examples of problems that people can submit,
yeah,
again, we're sort of going to try and improve there's the support within Unity for people to sort of even have like breaking configurations within Unity that are enabled and disabled by flags. That will enable us to then try and write a fix for those and enable what was previously a broken configuration that should be fixed under a given commit, for example.
yeah,
So again, if anybody is able to submit a sort of a reproducer in any way, shape, or form, that always helps to guide these things. And thank you to those people who have been submitting Textar-based reproducers. That's fantastic because they can just be almost copy pasted directly into the Q project's test setup. Tooling UX is, I think, one area that we haven't talked about as far as open issues are concerned. A point made by JCM and Joel Longtine in terms of sometimes it's not clear, and I guess Q Get Go is a really good example of that. Of the UX around that is not quite right. It perhaps belongs under a different command, and actually
yeah,
the way that dot slash dot 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 the sort of that package pattern is used is at times a bit confusing because people are trying to hold it slightly differently. I guess we need again more experience and examples of
yeah,
why people ran into issues and with those sorts of things.
yeah. Yeah, in GetGo, I think there is this proposal to do, like integrated with import, I
Yeah,
believe, or yeah,
yeah.
so to make it a little bit more consistent there.
So really to encourage folks, if there is anything about tooling that is not working for you, just sort of real examples as to why. There's a project out there that's using Q packages in a way that we just hadn't anticipated at all, right? And that's um, the Vector project for part of the Timber company, and they're part of Unity as well, which is great because they have a very significant amount of Q in there. But they're using packages in a very different way, and sort of good examples like that are fantastic because it helps to sort of check us in terms of hang on a second, is this actually have we got the UX right? So please keep feedback like that coming. Moving on from open issues, documentation. I've mentioned that word about 50 times now, so let's actually talk about documentation in a bit more detail. There are many places where the Q documentation is lacking. You only have to look at the documentation label in the issue tracker to see this. This picks up on questions from JCM and Stephen Harris. It's a key point and a key concern, for want of a better phrase, right? So I think perhaps a good idea to try and share some of the vision for at least our vision as it is right now, and that obviously needs to be shaped by others' contributions as well. A vision for that documentation and content strategy. Um, I think it's key that this is not documentation is not ever going to be something that is exclusively what the Q project will do. But having excellent, fully tested core documentation in the broadest sense gives a strong foundation on which others can build. So let's just think about, for example, Brian Kettleson and David Flanagan's project, Q Blocks. they use Q, and so have to explain to people how to use Q. Now, it would be somewhat crazy for them to have to write a guide on how to use Q, because one doesn't exist on the core Q website, right? So I think there's obviously real value for sort of the growing of the community in having good core documentation. So this is an area that we need to improve, right?
Yeah.
I think sort of talking about ideas in this space, again, leaning somewhat on the Go project and their experience. From a language perspective, having something like the Tour of Q, which is like the Tour of Go, which is an interactive way of learning the language, I think would be a very good next step. If we've already got the tutorial at the moment, haven't we, that sort of clicks through the language
Yeah,
features?
it's a bit outdated. Doesn't
Yeah.
include some of the newer concepts, but yeah.
The format of the Tour of Go is excellent in that respect. It's sort of like a single page application, very nice and interactive. It's got the playground live as part of it. So something like that would be great. The Q Playground, which was hacked together by me a long time ago now, definitely needs a refresh. Um, Tutorials, yes, lots of them. Language-based tutorials as part of Q sort of fall under the Tour of Q as well. This is the point at which I was going to mention the work that Tony Worm has done on tutorials and has been referenced by lots of people. Some variation on a theme like tutorials would be great, right? Because it takes real life examples and makes them interactive, particularly as far
Yeah.
as tooling is concerned. I think particularly as well of the work that I did with Play with Go, maybe there's some way that we can make those interactive as well, because if you're having to use the Q command a lot, like an interactive playground doesn't work with that at all. That's just for editing a file from a language perspective. Um, so yeah, something that combines perhaps Play with Go / tutorials, that feels like it has a good vibe to it, to my mind. We talked about effective Q.
Yeah.
That feels like a good next step as well.
Yeah, it's still very much on my mind, right? But I've been focused on you
What
know
is effective Q? What is its
yeah. So
background?
in Go, there's this documentation called Effective Go, which is also like a tutorial on the language, but a little bit higher level, that basically also describes sort of the whole idea, like the general concepts behind it.
Idioms
The
and things within the language.
pardon the
Idioms within the
the
language.
idioms and yeah, sort of the philosophy behind it.
Yep.
And for Q, this is particularly useful, right? To really teach people about, okay, how do you structure configurations, right? Like with making things ever more increasingly more specific versus inheritance. How do you deal with not having inheritance? The concept of cross-cutting and aspect orientedness, right? Like
Yep.
so how do you design even a configuration? Um, but also, a lot of the documentation is still centered around the original idea, where it was sort of like, okay, let's mimic the GCL case, right, where you're basically templating. But as it turns out, like a lot of people don't even want to rewrite their YAML or JSON, and neither do you have to,
Yep.
right? So it's sort of describing the different sort of modes in which you can use Q, right, as sort of a validation net over all your configuration versus really templating or reduction, right? And like all these things.
Yep.
Or how do you organize like all these concepts?
I guess one thing that cross-cuts all sort of any discussion about documentation is that translations into other languages. There's that is going to be a key thing. I think we see a lot of in China. There's a lot of use of Q, and where they have already translated and created their own documentation as part
It's
of the
going the
Q Bella
same route
project.
as Go, right?
Yeah.
And
So that's something that we need to. So sort of stepping back from all of this, I guess the key question is right. Automate before I talk step back. Automated testing of documentation is, to my mind, something that
yeah,
has to be very high near the top, because we just don't want this documentation to rot and to
yeah,
become not useful. We want it to stay consistent and work with the latest versions. But sort of stepping back, as I said, what are the next steps in this space? Well, I think what we need to do is establish what is a content strategy, and where people have ideas in this space, this would be massively appreciated. Um, Establish a content strategy, that one that provides a strong foundation for the Q project, and leverages the skills and expertise of the entire community. And I think particularly there of things like translation efforts, but also pointing to work that others have done. Tony's tutorials is a really good one, right? So, but trying to do this in a way that for the core Q project itself provides everybody a firm foundation on which to learn Q. Kind of moving a bit more quickly on now to proposals. We've touched on a number of these. Stephen Harris raised a question on when these significant proposals will be implemented. We talked as well about how the proposal process at the moment is not as formal as the Go project. That could well be something that we revisit. Tony, that picks up on a point that you made as well. But I guess, Marcel, with these proposals that are live at the moment, they're not. What needs to happen next with them?
Yeah, so some of them still have open issues, right? Like for example, the query proposal sort of depends on the required field proposal that needs to be solved first. And that one we ran into an issue, right? So we have to sort of redesign that or revisit it.
Mm-hmm.
That said, the same thing holds a little bit for the built-in proposal. So I see that some people have also asked, like, when will the built-ins proposal be implemented? So what is useful there is to basically so a lot of these proposals are not one monolithic thing per se. Some of the aspects of the query proposal already have been implemented, right? And there's definitely sections where we're sure enough that it can be implemented. So for example, when it comes to the built-ins, if people say like, well, this is a built-in I could really use now, right? Like instead of implementing everything, so we could say, okay, we'll pick this one built-in to implement now if people really want it, right? But if we don't know what people are most what's in the highest demand right now, or what people are most clamoring for, we
Yep.
also don't know to prioritize that, right? So yeah, so it's good to know like which specific features of proposals people want now, because even if the proposal can be implemented in its entirety, we can section off certain parts of it, perhaps.
That makes total sense. It just sort of listing the what are the major proposals at the moment. We've talked about a number of these in passing: the required fields proposal, the query proposal, the core built-ins proposal. Richard Jones asked a question about when that's going to land.
Yeah,
Again, you sort of you touched there on the points that will determine when something gets sort of
yeah,
finalized,
yeah,
approved, and then implemented. There's sort of three different phases there
yeah,
that sort of three different factors, I guess, sorry, that go into
yeah.
when something actually becomes usable at the end of the day.
Exactly, but there is one particular built-in that might affect how one represents protobufs, for example. So that's it's not going to be actually backwards incompatible, but this is might be one of these built-ins that gets priority because
Yep.
you know. But again, to Richard Jones, like if there's any specific built-ins that are more urgent than others, we would like to know about that.
Great. I think we saw in passing the any built-ins that use the current. Sorry, any built-ins that would replace the current use of bottom symbol would probably be fairly high up on some people's list.
Yeah,
We talked about modules and package management before. Slightly overloaded term here there's an embedding proposal that we have not yet created, but spoken to a few people about. Just to explain what I mean by embedding here, this is, if you like, a Q equivalent to the Go Embed directive. It is sort of broadly speaking how we imagine that. A proposal for unifying float and int as simply number. Marcel, you talked about that in passing before. Somebody raised a very long time ago a proposal for service support.
yeah,
Q test we talked about, Q run. Solomon Hikes in the past sort of suggested that actually Q command as it exists today could perhaps better be renamed Q run, Q space run, or just Q run as a separate command in and of itself.
separate commands. I think he suggested. Yeah.
Yeah. There's actually sort of a number of tweaks that need to happen to Q command, that tooling layer, as part of that. So I think that feels like a sort of a very natural thing to do as part of that proposal as well. We also talked as well about integration with other languages, sort of more native support for running Go code as part of the tooling layer as well. WebAssembly has been mentioned in the past as well.
Yes, absolutely. So this is different from using the APIs in different languages, right? This is
Yep.
really being able to invoke uh, Python, WebAssembly, Go, whatever, as part of a Q command run. And this would be something that needs to be available, of course, in anybody else building tools around Q. This
Yep.
would not be specific to Q command. Um, but yeah, something like that fits very well in the. So the whole reason why the tooling layer was invented was actually to allow this and to
Mm.
have complex computation not in configuration but separated from the configuration, right? So that there's a clear distinction between sort of unit tested computations and that are fixed, right, with a fixed semantics versus configuration that one should be able to change quickly and with confidence, right? So
Yep.
that's yeah, a big part of that. Yeah. So
Slightly.
so any suggestions there on how to do this smoothly, and like an is are welcome.
Just to re-emphasize, what we're talking about there is the tooling layer for Q
Yes.
itself. It is currently Q space command, the command of Q, if that isn't too overloaded. That, as Solomon has proposed, be renamed something like Q run for sort of a um, from a clarity perspective, and that is where we can make these external calls. Right, that's not
Yeah.
the non-Hermitic part of Q.
Exactly.
And it is actually an area that has that sort of declarative workflow has been very popular, and a number of other projects have picked up on that. So in particular, they've talked about and asked about how to make these more native calls to other
Yeah.
languages as well. So that's just to clarify the space that we're talking about there. Slightly smaller proposals, but very popular nonetheless, would be associative lists.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. So this would allow you to basically treat an array or a list rather as a map, right? So this is especially for the Kubernetes world where this is done all over the place, against the spec of JSON basically. But it's so for example, if you have a list of objects, right, taking one field in that object, and then let's say a name as a key, right,
Mm-hmm.
into this list. So if you're unifying, let's say, two of these lists with objects with the same name would get unified instead of using the position. So there's a notation for this. This is part of the query proposal. This is one of these things that you could take out, right? Like that you could do earlier before the query
Yep.
proposal is there. So that's
Very good point, yeah, because that does get mentioned in tandem with the query
yeah,
proposal.
yeah. It
Um,
has some overlap with the embedding proposal, believe it or not, but that's a different story, maybe.
there's a teaser for everybody there.
Yeah,
We talked about breaking changes before, and so we won't go into that. I guess the next steps, as far as these proposals are concerned, as we said, are to continue to try and move each of these forward, but driven by that blend of priority, which is a function of demand, but also ordering with respect to version one. I.e., things will have to happen in certain orders, in a certain order with respect to version one from a compatibility / breaking perspective. So we need to map out what that looks like. Just sort of stepping back a tiny bit more to say, okay, for the project itself, what do the next steps look like? From our perspective, I think the most important things are as follows: really getting back to the issue tracker, discussions, Slack and Twitter, interacting with the wider community, getting back to a regular release cycle. Obviously, there's a bit of catch up that's required before we can get to that point, but definitely regular releases were very good in the past, and we see them being a very good thing going forward. Driven, of course, by Unity helping to confirm that these releases are good. That, again, I can't think how many issues we caught using Unity in the last 2 or 3 releases. It was a fantastic way of,
a lot. Yeah.
yeah. So we need to first establish what the sequences of releases will be with respect to breaking changes and the priority features, as we talked about. Completing major proposals, as we just mentioned, coordinating that with respect to breaking changes is key as well. Starting to shape the order of work on those proposals, therefore, and then working through them in that in whatever order that comes out of the blender, if you like.
Yeah.
I guess one point, just was coming towards the end now, but so to focus on one thing, where can people help contribute? This has sort of been a regular theme to questions. We mentioned earlier there are many ways in which people can contribute. I guess it's probably just worth repeating that list, right? Because it's not just code contributions.
Yes. Absolutely. So again, just using Q, Unity, right? Like make sure that we don't break you, but also help us understand use cases, ground things in reality, or just telling us, or in addition, what just works well, what doesn't, right? Like where are the gripes with Q, where doesn't, um, maybe if somebody has a workflow issue with a tool, they might assume that everybody has that problem, but we really might not have that problem, right?
Yep.
So if we don't know about it, we won't fix it either. Um, so pointing out gaps. So for example, I saw this little blog post recently where people were comparing Rego to Polar to Q, and was pointing out some gaps in the ability of Q to implement certain policy. And this looked like a really easy thing to fix, right? So,
Mm.
like that's great feedback, right? Um, so again, raising issues, right? Like contributing to the discussions, any kind of feedback, really, right? Like the
Yep.
blog posts have been very helpful, also for advocacy point of view. Um, you know,
I
um,
guess also those people who help to manage issues, answer discussions, thank you.
yeah,
If in any situation you're sort of not sure of an answer to something, please feel free to CC. We're going to be getting back to the issue tracker, but please don't feel shy about CCing those who you think will be able to help. Code contributions, obviously, I think we do need to slightly flesh out the contribution process to make clearer how we can manage that process at scale. And as I said, hopefully the live stream about how to make mechanically to make a code contribution via GitHub or Gerrit Hub will help those who want to consider that in the future as well. I guess people contributing thoughts to proposals, we've talked about that a lot. Contributing use cases, edge cases to proposal discussions, critical in helping us short circuit those conversations. Um, yeah, and sort of any community events, yeah, live streaming, whatever it might be. Um, I think it's fair to say that we'd also be very keen to start conversations about building long-term contributor relationships. We talked about like the different encoding support. If somebody turns up and says, I would like to add encoding support for TOML, for example, and helped as part of that for us as the project to establish, okay, what does it mean to add a different encoding support as like a meta thing that we do first of all, that would be very much appreciated, right? That sort of long term commitment, as we sort of seen in the Go project, is has been very very valuable. I guess telling us how you use Q as well. There's been a number of people who do via blog posts or via messages into Slack. Do tell us how you're using Q. Tell us how your company is using Q. There are companies for a long time, Marcel, that have been listed on the website that users of Q.
yeah. And if anybody else would like to have their logo on there, or think that it would be nice for them to show, like that shows support for Q, that might be like be nice for them to tell
Yep.
about it. And we should maybe also consider to having a little story behind each of these logos, like how exactly are they using it and what are their benefits. So that might
A
be,
link to a blog post if there
yeah,
even is one, for
yeah,
example. Um, Again, I'll just stress Unity is a fantastic way for people to
yeah,
contribute. And following us on Twitter, I'm going to try and put this up
yeah,
again. There we
yeah,
go. Is a
yeah,
really good way to stay in touch. And then if you also tweet using that handle as well, we'll see the notification and can start to retweet some of the ways in which people are using Q as
yeah.
well. Um, Anything else, Marcel, on that?
Yeah, no, just even if the logo is up, like just to give you an example, like there's the Istio logo, right? They're using it um, for one use case that I knew of, but now it turns out they're using it for something else, and I didn't even know, right? So just the fact that the logo is on there doesn't even mean we know what's all going on, right?
Well,
So
true, and also actually people contributing use cases again to issues slash proposals, whatever it might be. I think we need to do a better job of actually communicating the existence of these proposals, because unless you happen to stumble across the issue tracker, people don't necessarily know they exist. And I guess this is quite a nice segue to future town halls slash future community events, right? How can we better stay in touch with the community and share there's been a lot to go through today, but maybe some future sessions will be more specific. on specific topics. So, for example, we might do a deep dive on the required fields proposal, because guess what? We need feedback from people, and actually spending a quick half hour, an hour talking about the proposal itself is just a good starting point to get other people involved in the conversation. We in any future community events, we will do a better job of acknowledging there are lots of people in lots of different time zones. So again, apologies to those who weren't able to join live today. Um, Again, if there's a way in such an event, we can have people share how they're using Q, like a guest slot with somebody coming on to talk about a novel way in which they're using Q. More participation, the better, to my mind. It could even extend to some live streaming, that where we do a bit of a Q&A on how to use Q in a given situation. Again, letting us know how you're using Q is a good way to sort of motivate deciding what sessions would be good in that respect. And I think we probably need to have dedicated YouTube channels and etc., as opposed to piggybacking on my YouTube channel for these sorts of events in the future. Anything else on future town hall or community events, Marcel?
Yeah, no, I think that sounds good. I think also, yeah, indeed, inviting users to show how they use Q is a
Yeah,
very powerful way to show the variety and
yeah, absolutely.
give people ideas, or us ideas even.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. As far as changes in the project on the language are concerned, so I guess we're 20 minutes over. Apologies for that. But in closing, thank you to those who have helped prepare for today. There are a number of people behind the scenes who have helped to contribute. Thank you to those who asked questions ahead of time, whether publicly in the GitHub discussions or offline. Much appreciated. As we said, thank you to all those people who have contribute to the Q project. As we said, that long list of ways in which people can contribute, whether it be literally just using Q to creating issues, whatever it might be. Um, and we look forward to the next community session, whatever that might be. We'll publish details or tweet details via Twitter. We may do a similar kind of thing where we'll hope the future sessions will endeavor to make them more interactive, because that is more exciting than
Yeah.
having people submit ahead of time. But we look forward to that next session either way. Thanks,
Thank you,
Marcel.
everybody.
See you then. Bye bye.
Till next time.